Okay, Professor Figagi is a surgeon of the brain, and I am a scientist of the brain. Our particular research interests focus on clinical neuroscience when it comes to brain injury, and in particular, pediatric brain injury. So some of the scope of the talks that we will give over the course of this week are not in our area of expertise, but we aim to give you as faithful an account of those as we can. So the week is going to start with looking at the brain from the gross anatomy and the function. Then we will look tomorrow at why neuroscience is one of the great frontiers of our time. And we will follow that on with stories of the history of the discovery of the brain and its complexities. We'll talk about how we use our brains to actually study our brains. And I hope that in this time we can give you a taste of the splendors of the brain that we have the privilege to work with on a daily basis. So it's my privilege to introduce Professor Tony Figagi. He is the head of paediatric neurosurgery at Red Cross Children's Hospital. He is the scientific chair of the South African Society of Neurosurgeons and recently handed over his 3-year tenure as scientific chair for the International Society of Paediatric Neurosurgery. He's held the position of national research chair for clinical neurosciences. He was also the president of the International Neurotrauma Society. He is a founding member and steering committee member of a global neurotrauma organization, Global Neuro. He works as part of many international consortia on neurotrauma and on developing guidelines, international guidelines for the treatment of neurotrauma. I think you'd be shy if I said this, but I can tell you with all sincerity he is one of the most respected, most skilled, and most liked neurosurgeons in the world today. So apart from being an excellent surgeon, he's also a stellar academic. He's published over 150 academic papers. He has written in and edited on many textbooks. He supervised over 20 students. And he's really created the research enterprise that currently exists and is so productive at Red Cross Children's Hospital. So it's a great honor for me to introduce him, and I hope that you enjoy today and the rest of the week. Thank you.
Okay, I hope that won't make as much sound. So, that was a great and very humbling introduction. And I'm a bit ambivalent about introductions like that because on one hand it makes me feel really good. On the other hand, it sets your expectations really, really high, and I can only go downhill from there. So the first thing to say is I'm really impressed with the number of people who are here. In part because I just love the idea of people who are interested beyond the things that they have to be interested in, their job or just living life, but just curious about things, wanting to know things. And some of my biggest heroes in history are people who have known a lot about lots of different things that they weren't necessarily employed to do. And this is one of the pictures from Leonardo da Vinci's collection. He's one of the renowned polymaths, Renaissance men and women. And what is characteristic of all of them is a curiosity. They just really want to learn about things. And of course, my area is the brain, so I'm particularly interested in the brain, particularly people want to know about the brain. So before I get started, a couple of things. So are any of you medical apart from Professor Moll that I saw? I've got one medical person. I'm going to have to up my game for that. And another one. Okay, so, and another one. So, okay, so I can't tell you any fanciful stories. So, yeah, maybe I should turn the light down a bit. Unfortunately, it's I hope you can see me, not that it's necessary. So of course, I'm particularly interested in the brain. The brain is the core of who we are. It's an incredibly fascinating organ. It's the most fascinating organ. It's not only the capacity that we have and that we use every day, but it's the capacity that we can tap into. It's what makes us distinctly human, what separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom, and also makes us distinctly different from every other human. And the degree to which we use various faculties, obviously within a population, varies considerably. But we all have, we all, of course, have our place in the world, and our place in the world is defined by our brain. A couple of disclaimers first, and you need to know a little bit more about me than what Dr. Rohlwink told you, so you can frame everything that I have to say accordingly. So, as you heard, I am a surgeon, and as surgeons, we are a particular breed. We do not like to be confused with physicians. So my physician counterpart would be a neurologist. So for my sake, don't confuse me with a neurologist, and for a neurologist's sake, they don't want you to confuse me with them either. See, because our paths diverted a long, long time ago. So centuries ago, and this was an example. So this is the physician. The physicians were the actual doctors. Surgeons weren't doctors. So the physicians were the university-educated ones. They were the professors. They were the upper-class citizens. And but they didn't want to get their hands dirty. So there are two ways you had to get your hands dirty. One was doing dissections of bodies for students, and that's how you learned about anatomy. And most of medicine, several centuries ago, a millennia ago, was about kind of the physical aspect of the body. They didn't want to get their hands dirty, and if you had to have something taken out of your body or a limb lopped off, they certainly didn't want to get their hands bloody. So they called the barbers to do that, and literally they were barbers. And why were they barbers? Because you didn't have to be particularly smart, you just had to be skilled with the blade. So the first surgeons were called barber surgeons, and they were the lower class citizens. The physicians looked down on them because they weren't particularly smart, they weren't educated, they were just good with a knife. And they could do all the things that the physician wouldn't have to do, and the physician stood on a chair, and so that's why we still have a chair of neurosurgery, a chair of academia, because literally they would sit on a chair, on the little throne, divorced from all the activity of people who would do. So those were the barber surgeons. Now, fortunately, over time, things have changed. And barber surgeons have become more educated. Now we're also doctors, although in England, many of you will know, you still refer to a surgeon as Mr. So that's a throwback to those days, because they weren't allowed to be called doctors because they weren't doctors. And now they wear it as a badge of honor or badge of pride to separate themselves from the physicians. And in fact, the surgeons, especially in North America, earn so much more than the physicians. Except here in South Africa in the government sector where I work. But my American colleagues never let me, they always ask me, so tell us again, a physician earns as much as you do? And they walk away with their heads shaking and laughing. And so we've had this ongoing rivalry between physicians and surgeons, always about who's better. And I came across this academic article that was published in the British Medical Journal, little tongue-in-cheek, to test the hypothesis that on average, male surgeons are taller and better looking than male physicians. And they had a control group and to compare both sets of doctors with film stars who played doctors on screen. So we're happy to find that the results were that surgeons were significantly taller than physicians and better looking. But, and the sting in the tail was that the film stars who played doctors on screen are better looking than both of the groups of doctors. So we're also said to be, for some reason, quite arrogant as surgeons. I don't know quite where that comes from. I've got a 13-year-old daughter. She says to me, "Dad, you're arrogant." I said, "No, I'm not arrogant." She said, "Yes, you are." So I said, "It's not arrogant if you can back it up." And she says, "Wow, you see, that's what I mean, you're arrogant." So a friend of mine sent me this video clip that did the rounds over Christmas.
Can I get you a drink?
Yeah, something soft. I'm driving. Parking's an absolute nightmare around here, isn't it? Had to reverse into the tiniest of spaces. Still, I managed it. I mean, Parking's not exactly brain surgery, is it? And I should know.
Why is that? Are you a doctor?
Careful. Not a doctor. I'm a brain surgeon. Big difference. Big difference. Yeah, I actually know a joke about this. What's the difference between a doctor and a brain surgeon? One's not exactly brain surgery. The other is brain surgery. So, what do you guys do?
I'm an accountant.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I could do with an accountant. Filling in those tax forms can get really confusing, can't it? Still, it's not exactly brain surgery, is it? I mean, brain surgery, believe me, is very complex. Are you an accountant too?
No, I work for a charity.
Oh, that's a very selfless job, isn't it? I really admire you. I don't think I could ever do what you do. I say that because it's emotionally draining, not because it's hard. I mean, it's not exactly brain surgery, is it? Which, as a brain surgeon, is what I do.
Lionel, here's your drink. Lionel's a brain surgeon, you know. Yeah, he mentioned it. Oh, Jeff, they keep you late at the Space Centre.
As always.
This food round. Have you met Lionel?
No, hello, Lionel.
So, Jeff, how do you earn a crust?
I'm a scientist. I work mainly with rockets. It's pretty tough work. What do you do?
Why, I don't mean to boast, but I'm a brain surgeon.
Brain surgery? Not exactly rocket science, is it?
So people have called us arrogant. We don't think of ourselves as arrogant, but we do think the cardiac surgeons are arrogant. And we also have a rivalry with the cardiac surgeons that goes back years and years and years. And it's more than just a rivalry between cardiac surgeons and neurosurgeons. It's about this debate about what was central to who we are. Was it the brain or was it the heart? And for millennia, the heart ruled. And it was thought that the brain was the repository of our soul, our spirit, or that organ that gave us life. So even in ancient Egypt, when we're buried, at least in some, their organs, their internal organs were all taken out except their heart. So their heart was preserved. And the reason they preserved their heart was because the heart was thought to be the key to eternity. And their heart would literally be weighed by the god Anubis. And if it was found to be heavy with guilt, the heart would be consumed by the god monster Ammit. And if the heart was lighter than the feather of Ma'at, which is the goddess of truth and justice, then they would pass into the realms of eternity. But as for the brain was literally discarded. So they used to punch a metal rod through the nose, because you can access the brain through a very thin plate at the base of the skull. And they used to crunch up the brain and suck it out and discard it. Because that's what the brain was thought to be useless. And in fact, when you look at the etymology of the word, as much as we know of it anyway, the brain comes from an Old English word called bregan, which is thought to also originate from an Old French word called bran, which was a word for refuse or waste matter. So it was never really considered that the brain. And things almost changed between the 4th and 5th century BC. This is when the Greek civilization started to take over. And the father of medicine is Hippocrates. And Hippocrates got it right. He said, it ought to be generally known that the source of our pleasure, merriment, laughter, and amusement, as of our grief, pain, anxiety, and tears, is none other than the brain. So he thought, okay, so now finally the world has realized that there's something particularly important about the brain. But Hippocrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle was even greater than Hippocrates. So Aristotle, of course, was a tutor to Alexander the Great. He built the great Lyceum University in Athens, and Aristotle is widely considered the world's greatest biologist that ever lived. And is also considered to have been the last person who knew everything that was to be known at that particular time. And his works went on to change the world. He got it spectacularly wrong about the brain. And of course, the brain is not responsible for any of the sensations at all. The correct view is that the seat and source of sensations is the region of the heart. He got that spectacularly wrong, but again, he drove the world in terms of his view of where the seat of the soul and the mind is. And that is in all the historical texts. If you look at the Bible is full of hundreds of references about the heart, nothing about the brain. If you look at the text, so Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are filled with characters who are driven by passions of the heart, not of the brain. And it's taken us a long time to appreciate that the heart is nothing more than a physical pump. That's all it is. As I was telling my cardiac surgeon colleagues, that it's just a pump. It's just a muscular bag. It's got 4 chambers. It's got 4 blood vessels. It's got 4 valves. And it exists only to circulate blood around the body, most importantly to the brain. So very much it's like your pool pump at home, but not so sophisticated. That's all it is. But the English language, the language that we use, is still replete with this ancient concept that we haven't gotten rid of. The heart is something central. So our language, our phrases, it's at the heart of the matter. He had a good heart. The heart wants what the heart wants. She died of a broken heart. Of course she didn't die of a broken heart. She died of a broken brain, maybe. In the sense, if you're hopeless, if you're despondent, if you're heart sore, and again, there the heart comes in, it's not generated from your heart. These are feelings that are generated by your brain. So our language, unfortunately, is still anachronistic and reflects wrong anatomy back in the day. So, but please don't tell my surgical colleagues that it'd be absolutely devastated by this. And I don't have the heart to tell them, really. So we're going to talk about the brain. So the purpose of this whole lecture, now that I finally get going, is to teach you a little bit about the brain, but not necessarily in all this complexity. We're going to step back a little bit and talk just very broadly what various parts of the brain do and how we know what they do. That looks a little less complex. Unfortunately, the brain never comes either color-coded or with these little numbers. Looks more like this operatively, and you've got to figure out what to do. But we're going to step back a little bit and just make it color-coded. I wish it was color-coded, make our job a lot easier. And we're going to start off with the various lobes of the brain. And maybe this is also a good time to say, if you have any questions, feel free to stop me. My flow isn't going to be disturbed in any way. If you have any questions, we can stop, we can talk about it, we can move on. All right, so very briefly, there are 2 hemispheres, 2 cerebral hemispheres. 2 cerebral hemispheres, there's a middle bit that we call the diencephalon. At the bottom that we call the hindbrain, or the brainstem, of the cerebellum, and the brainstem. A lot of little important bits in between. So this is looking at the brain from the side, this is the front, this is the back, top and bottom. So the frontal lobe, firstly. The frontal lobe is probably what makes us most distinctly human. So it's the source of our intellect, it's a source of our cognition, it's a source of our judgment. So people with injury to the frontal lobe, not only do they calculate badly, they also judge badly. They'll engage in risky behaviors. They'll do things that are inappropriate in a social setting. They'll pull down their pants at a cocktail party. Those are people with deficits in the frontal lobe. And at the back of the frontal lobe over here, there's a thing called the motor strip. So it's right at the back of the frontal lobe. The motor strip is responsible for controlling all your limb movements, both the gross movements as well as the fine movements. So you running and jumping and doing javelin and you painting and drawing, calligraphy and piano, all of this is controlled by the motor strip. The motor strip has got what's called a homunculus, so the leg area is up there and somewhat on the inside, and down here you get to the arms, and then you get to the face and the lips. And the area of the cortex that is responsible is in proportion to the number of muscles and the fine movements that are controlled. So the leg area is actually quite a small area. The hand area is much bigger. The face area, and particularly the lips, has got a much larger cortical representation because it's so important to our expression and communication as humans. So that's the motor strip. The left side controls the right side. The right side controls the left side. The parietal lobe, so if you feel these prominences of your bone over here, those are called parietal eminences. If you go in further there, you get the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is really interesting. Unlike the frontal lobe, like the frontal lobe, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. It's slightly different between the two. It's the same in the sense that there's this portion of here is called the sensory strip. So it's the sensation analog to the motor strip. So that's where all your sensations are registered. Again, the right side registers on the left side registers on the right side. So all your sensation from light touch to pinprick to warm and cold to wet and dry to vibration to position sense, where is my hand in time and how are my fingers configured, all of that is registered in that sensory strip over there. And then other functions of the parietal lobe are visuospatial skills, especially on the right. So your ability to throw a ball, your ability to parallel park or inability to parallel park, it's all there in your parietal lobe. It's also for sequencing and managing tasks that require methodical sequencing without you having to think about it. So people with deficits of the parietal lobe might not know how to dress. So when you dress, you don't think about it. You'll put a jacket on and you'll button your jacket without necessarily having to think about the sequence of events that have to go into putting your jacket on and buttoning it. But for somebody with a stroke, for instance, in that area, they can be fully conscious, fully aware. All their calculations may be perfectly fine. Their speech may be completely fine, but you ask them to put on a jacket and they can't remember how to put it on, because it's a problem with the sequencing part of the parietal lobe. And then the occipital lobe is your visual cortex, so that's here at the back. So your visual cortex works like this. So your eyes, you will see an image, there's light that strikes the retina, that gets converted into electrical signals into the optic nerves. And then the optic nerves run back, and they do a funny thing where half the fibers cross over to the other side. So the fibers from your left field of vision cross over to the right side of the brain. Your fibers from the left side of your vision cross over to the right side of the brain. And then they split, they run through the parietal lobe and through the temporal lobe. They send a whole bunch of other connections to the brainstem, and in particular to the muscles that move your eyes. And they eventually register you on the visual cortex where you see an object. The cerebellum, or the little brain or the hindbrain, it sits here at the bottom, probably the oldest form of the brain, and it's responsible for posture and balance. So your general posture and balance, your coordination of motor movement, your sense of rate and rhythm, all of that is controlled by your cerebellum. And then in front of the cerebellum is a brainstem, which is like the funnel of all these complex fibers from your motor strip, for example, funneling down into an area that's about the size of your thumb before it goes off to your spinal cord, and then all the nerves that go to controlling your arms and legs, as well as the cell bodies of all the nerves that come to your face. So moving your face, the sensation of your face, your swallowing, clearing your throat, all of that comes out through this brainstem. And even more so in this area, spectacularly called, and everybody remembers it from school biology, the medulla oblongata. It's just one of those names that sticks in your memory, doesn't it? The oblongata is really, really fascinating part of the brain, because there's a small area at the back of it called the callus scriptoris, literally less than the size of your fingernail, but incredibly sensitive, and it controls your heart rate and it controls your breathing. And it's so sensitive that when you operate on that area, even if you just put cold water on it, or you slightly manipulate it, you can stop the heart. It's happened to me twice, operatively, and it's a devastating feeling. Fortunately, everything was fine, but it's a devastating feeling just to watch, say, the anaesthetist, usually the anaesthetist sitting there reading the newspaper, and they fall off their chair because suddenly the heart stopped. But again, it's a manifestation of the incredible complexity and sensitivity of small parts of the brain. Okay, so that's the brainstem. So this is what the brainstem would look like. Oh, coming up to the brainstem, this is the upper spot of the spinal cord, and there are nerves that go off at every level. And I thought I'd just show you, if you put a camera in, I don't know where that shines from. If you put a camera in, so this is in one of the water spaces of the brain. So this is what the brainstem will look like. Lots of arteries and veins. And then these are cranial nerves. So this happens to be the nerve that goes to the hearing, and it goes through the same little aperture in the bone as the nerve to the face. This is the nerve to the sensation of the face. So that's what it looks like. This is called the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is a fascinating organ for many, many different reasons. Lots of things happen in the temporal lobe. We'll talk about speech a little bit later. Some of the visual fibers run through the temporal lobe before they get to the visual cortex. And then on the inside of the temporal lobe, on the very inner part of the temporal lobe, there are a couple of structures, one called the amygdala, one called the hippocampus. They are incredible structures. They're part of what's called the limbic system of the brain. Again, a very old, ancient, primitive part of the brain that does a lot of things, but very broadly, it helps you to interpret your material world, helps you to make sense of it. Is this something that I should be concerned about? And in particular, the amygdala is what we call the so what part of the brain. So it sees a visual image, and the question is, do I need to pay attention to this? Do I need to worry about this? It's often called the fear center. It does a little bit more than fear, but it's called the fear center because it recognizes something that's dangerous to you and it immediately kicks in without necessarily engaging your cognition that this is a dangerous situation. So we'll get back to the amygdala. It's called the amygdala because it's an old Greek word for almond, and literally it looks like a little almond in the brain when you take it out. Sometimes you have to take it out. And then it's connected to the hippocampus. Now the hippocampus is like the hard drive of your brain. So that's where all your memories, your old memories and your recent memories, your memories of things that you had to learn, your procedural memories, everything is stored in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a fascinating structure because it's so interconnected. One of those strong connections, for instance, is with the olfactory area. So olfaction is smell. So that's why the hippocampus is also the source of deja vu. And that's also why a smell can dislodge a memory in your mind. You get a particular smell, and then suddenly you remember where you were 15 years ago or 20 years ago when you smelled that smell. And it's not just a cognitive memory, it's an emotional memory as well, because often you'll feel exactly like you felt. And it's just the smell that will dislodge that from your hippocampus, even though it's been buried there for 15, 20 years. The hippocampus is also an area that commonly is a site of epilepsy, both in children and adults. So epilepsy is a mass discharge of electrical activity throughout the brain in a completely uncontrolled way. And that's why there are lots of different manifestations of it, but patients will fall down and will do that jerk that you always see in the movies. And often it comes from the hippocampus. We don't quite know why, but one of the peculiar things is, not always, but very often, patients, before they have the seizure, they will have something called an aura. And the aura varies greatly between different people. It can be a visual image, so it'll be like a visual hallucination that they'll have. Or it could be auditory. Or it could be tactile. They'll feel something creeping on their skin. Or they'll feel this vague gastrointestinal discomfort. Or they'll smell something, the smell of burnt toast, for instance, and then they know that a seizure is coming. And then a seizure always comes afterwards. And there are many, many well-known epileptics throughout history. Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian author, he was one of them. So he had epilepsy. And he often described his epilepsy as a demon, but he described his aura very differently. And some people have almost orgasmic auras. And he described his aura before the seizure came as a feeling of great ecstasy, of a bliss so powerful that it made his body ache. But then, of course, afterwards came the seizure. And the hippocampus is that source, and that's why at one point it was thought to be somehow our connection with the divine. But anyway, back to the amygdala. So as I said, your amygdala helps you to figure out how to respond to an environment. So if you see a dog, a snarling Rottweiler, there's first the sensory information that comes in. The sensory information through your eyes comes in. It goes through your thalamus, a little egg-shaped structure on either side of your brain in the middle. And the thalamus is like a relay center. So it sends information to your visual cortex, it sends information down to your hippocampus, to your frontal lobe, because cognitively you appreciate there's a dog there, right? But you can't rely on your cognitive brain to kick in before you need to take action. So those relays also go directly to your amygdala, and your amygdala and your hippocampus, because it's got to access memories. And it's got to access memories in terms of determining this is a dog. It's a dog, it's a particularly bad type of dog, it's a Rottweiler, he's snarling. So you've got to access memories in terms of what does it mean to you, should you be afraid of it or not. And maybe also haul out memories of your personal experience with dogs in the past. And then the amygdala kicks in. The amygdala sends immediate information to a little structure that we'll talk about in a moment called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is another amazing structure of the brain because it's right at the bottom of the brain. It's around about the size of your thumbnail and about the thickness of your thumbnail as well. And it does all these incredible things which I'll talk about in a moment. But probably the most memorable group of things, group of activities, a group of animal behaviors that it controls, and what we were taught is that it prepares you for the 4 F's of animal behavior. So that's feeding, fleeing, fighting, and sexual congress. So those are the 4 things that it will prepare you for. That is the hypothalamus. And so it's sending this ping to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland, floods the body with hormones immediately. So you're confronted with this dog and suddenly your pupils dilate, your mouth dries up, you lose bladder control, the blood suffuses to your muscles because you've got to be prepared to be tense to either fight or, if you're more sensible, to flee the situation. And all of that happens within millimeters and all driven by the amygdala. So it's small, but it is fascinating. So this is what if you took off the top of the brain, that's left and right hemisphere, that's the thalamus, and the limbic system, the hippocampus and the fornix wraps around this egg shape of the thalamus. A really fascinating part of the brain. And then the thalamus, at least the hypothalamus, as I said, it's at the base of the brain. I like to think of the hypothalamus as the conductor of the symphony of the body, or the orchestra. It conducts just about everything. So sure, the 4 F's, but it controls your temperature regulation. It controls how much you eat, how full you feel after you eat, how you balance your fluid intake. It controls your heart rate and your blood pressure. Again, this is one of the, I'll show you the hypothalamus a little bit later, but again, if you put cold water on it, you can stop the heart. It's an amazing structure. And then it controls the pituitary gland. It's got a little connection between the hypothalamus, a stalk to the pituitary gland, and it controls the pituitary gland's release of hormones. And these are all the hormones of life. So these are growth hormone, the hormone that determines how much or how little you grow. Steroid hormones, thyroid hormones, the hormones of sexual reproduction and sexual cycle, like FSH and LH, that control your menstrual cycle and your ovarian cycle. And it's all under control of an area that literally is the size of your thumbnail and as thin as that. That's called the hypothalamus. All right, so if you took a section through the brain like this, this would be the one hemisphere on the right, and this would be on the left and inside. You also have these bizarre chambers inside the brain. There are 4 chambers, one in each hemisphere, one in the middle, and one at the back and around the hindbrain, and they're called ventricles. This is what they look like if you could peer inside the brain. So this is the one on the one side. This is the one in the middle, and it's connected with a little string called an aqueduct into the 4th ventricle, which is in the hindbrain. And this is called the fluid. It's called brain fluid, or when it gets out, it's called spinal fluid. And this fluid gets produced all the time inside the ventricles by little structures called choroid plexus. I'll show you what it looks like. It looks like soft coral for those who are scuba divers. And this produces about 600, 700, 800 mils of fluid every day. But there's only about 175 mils at any given point in time. So that fluid gets turned over all the time. It gets constantly produced by the choroid plexus. It runs out of that fourth ventricle. It goes around the surface of the brain, around the surface of the spinal cord. There are some, how shall we say, alternative methods of therapy that talk about how they can adjust your spinal fluid flow. If you want to know what I think about it, I'll tell you afterwards. But we don't really know the purpose of this fluid. It's called cerebrospinal fluid. But it seemed quite mystical, and at one point it was thought that surely this must be the generator of the soul or the spirit, because it just seems so mystical, this fluid that was being generated spontaneously by the brain, and it's right in the center of the brain. Probably isn't so mystical. Probably has some mechanism of flushing the brain, and more importantly, it creates buoyancy of the brain. Because the brain is the only organ, you've heard me say at length about how special it is, but it's the only organ that is completely encased in bone, because it's the most important organ that needs to be protected. But the protection of the brain can also be its prison. If you take a severe knock to the head, for instance, and there are bruises inside the brain and there's swelling that occurs, the pressure inside the brain can go up remarkably high because the skull can't expand. And so that's what happened. And sometimes we have to do something called the decompressive craniectomy, which is an operation where you've got to take a big part of the bone, sometimes the whole side of the one side off, just to control the swelling inside the brain. And that's what happened to Michael Schumacher. As you know, a couple of years ago, he took a really bad knock to the head. He had bruises inside the brain. He had this incredible swelling. The pressure rose to the point where it was cutting off blood supply to the brain, and he had to have this operation where a big part of the bone was taken off. But unfortunately for him, it was too late. So the very thing that protects us, that can be our prison. But this water around the brain gives it buoyancy. So every time you look left and right, or you have a minor knock to the head, the brain doesn't keep bumping up against these hard ridges on the inside of the skull because it's surrounded by fluid. So sometimes we've got a camera inside the brain, just like I showed you earlier, and I thought I'd show you this as well. Sometimes you have a blockage to those pipes. So it's like you're plumbing at home. These cavities are connected with little openings, or these little aqueducts, and sometimes you can have, for instance, a tumor that blocks over here, or a bit of blood clot that blocks that little pipe because it's a thin pipe. And regardless of whether it's blocked or not, that choroid plexus is stuff that makes the water just keeps on going. It doesn't stop. It just keeps on going. And of course, then the water pressure builds up in here because it can't get out, and it puts pressure on the brain from the inside. So sometimes if you've got an obstruction here, we put a camera in, we go from one of those big ventricles to one, and then we make the hypothalamus. And I just went on at length about how important it is, but if you know what you're doing, you can make a small hole in the hypothalamus. And you've got to be careful because there's a very important blood vessel. You'll see that a bit later, called the basilar artery, that supplies all the blood to the brainstem, which again is the engine room of the brain. It does give us this beautiful view. So this is the choroid plexus. I told you it's like soft coral. That's what makes the fluid. And this is going from the one cavity into the other one. So here you're going into what's called the third ventricle. So it's right in the middle. And at the floor of the third ventricle, this is called the hypothalamus. And that little red spot is where the pituitary gland takes off. These are called the mammillary bodies, for obvious reasons, of the hypothalamus. Sometimes you've got to make a hole over there. And you have to be careful about it, of course, because it's the hypothalamus, but if you choose the spot, you can do it quite safely. And the idea is to make a hole and access the outside of the brain. And once you've done that, then you've bypassed that obstruction further kind of downstream, and you'll see suddenly the water starts flowing across there. And we make that hole a little bit You can have a look all the way down the base of the brain, down the brainstem, as I showed you. So this is that basilar artery, the artery I said you should avoid coming up, and all these little blood vessels are supplying the brainstem. And these little fine threads, this part of outside the brain is called the subarachnoid space. It's called arachnoid because literally these look like spider webs. This is another example of the same thing. So you've got that hole there. This is the basilar artery supplying brainstem, and you have all these spider webs in the brain. The subarachnoid space. I don't know the exact number, but what you know, the catheter that you see in the first catheter that we put in is about 2 millimeters, 1.5 millimeters across. So it's quite small. Okay, so back to this. So that was the third ventricle, and another fascinating part of the third ventricle. Anybody know what that's called? That's called the pineal gland, and the pineal gland has been the source of great history, great mysticism, because the pineal gland is called the third eye of the brain. So there's a huge amount of mysticism about the so-called third eye, and massive industries of how you can unlock your consciousness to some astral planes. Here it says a tiny pea-sized gland shaped like a pine cone. That's why it's called pineal. It holds the secrets to spiritual wisdom, inspiration, and psychic awareness. The pineal gland is vital for physical, mental, and spiritual health, while also being a gateway to higher consciousness. The pineal gland is said to be the third eye chakra, otherwise known as ajna, or the eyebrow chakra, which is set back in between our two physical eyes. So how you can expand your consciousness, and this also.
Every human being's pineal gland, or third eye, can be activated to spiritual world frequencies, which enables you to have the sense of all-knowing, godlike euphoria, and oneness all around you. A pineal gland once tuned into to proper frequencies, with help of meditation, yoga, or various esoteric, occult methods, enables a person to travel into other dimensions, popularly known as astral travel, astral projection, or remote viewing. With more advanced practice and ancient methods, it is also possible to control the thoughts and actions of people in the physical world.
Now, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news for those of you who do want to astral project, but you can't do that with your pineal gland. But like with most things, there's a grain of truth to it. So it's thought that primitively, so this is probably our commonest vertebrate ancestor, the pineal gland was a photoreceptor organ. And it was much more superficially located in the midline, right at the top of the head. And it's a photoreceptor organ, so it detects light and dark. And we as vertebrates don't need the pineal gland. We don't need that photoreceptor anymore. So it's a vestigial organ that has now been buried right in the middle of the brain. In fact, it's bizarre. It is the only unpaired organ inside the brain. And it still retains some of its primitive connection to circadian rhythms. So the pineal gland secretes melatonin. And many of you will know about melatonin is the sleep hormone. So there's a very complicated connection between the eyes, the photoreceptors of the eyes. They detect light or dark, and they send signals to something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, and then to nuclei around the ventricle, and then to the spinal cord and the brainstem, and eventually up to the pineal gland. And the pineal gland secretes melatonin in response to dark. So that's why it's a sleep hormone. But unfortunately, you can't use it to astral project. But there are still some mysteries of the pineal gland that must reflect ancient development or evolution from our commonest ancestor, because there's a rare condition where you can have a tumor of the eye called the retinoblastoma. So that it's uncommon, but it's not rare. But rarely you will have two retinoblastomas, so one in each eye. And then exceptionally rarely, you'll have a retinoblastoma in each eye and simultaneously that same tumor in the pineal gland. It's called a trilateral retinoblastoma. We don't really understand it, but it's somehow this primitive, long-standing connection between this third eye and then the physical eyes that we use. All right, so now I think you're pretty decent with your anatomy. You'll be able to detect structures in what's called the coronal plane, so this is from front to back. The horizontal plane from bottom to top, and the sagittal plane from side to side. So it's worth you remembering that, because if you ever have occasion to have an MRI scan, and God forbid that you don't, and you're talking to a neurologist, or God forbid a neurosurgeon, you can have a look at the MRI yourself now and see that you've recognized that structure, and that's exactly what the MRI looks like. So your cerebral hemisphere, oh, we forgot to mention the corpus callosum, maybe we'll get to that on Wednesday. That's the brainstem, this is the cerebellum, there's your hypothalamus. And sometimes you have an inverted image. Now the white is all water, so that's the cerebrospinal fluid that's flowed out of those ventricles and around the surface of the brain. You can look at it as a cut, what's called a coronal cut, and exactly that's what it looks like. There's two ventricles on either side. This is the corpus callosum, this broad swath of fibers that connects your left to right hemisphere and allows them to talk. And then the horizontal view, those are the water spaces. And remember, sometimes I said those water spaces get blocked up. This is what it looks like when it's blocked up. Okay, so now you guys have got a reasonably good grounding for anatomy. Neurosurgery 101, we can start next year. You got a pretty good way of looking at the MRI scan, so I think we're good to go in terms of practical decision making. But what about some of the myths about the brain? So many of you would have heard, or maybe even embrace, and again, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but this whole idea of the left-right brain dichotomy doesn't really exist. So you know it's popular in neuroscience, it's popular in people doing all sorts of entrepreneurial work and working with children and students. It's about unlocking your creativity, because either you're a left-brain person, which is supposed to be very rational, very methodical, very thoughtful, or you're a right-brain person who's very creative. And the idea being that you can unlock these creative aspects of you, all the rational aspects of you, depending on where your deficiencies lie. And it's literally as simple as unlocking left and right brain. The problem is it's not true. So there's no good evidence that suggests there's any laterality of the brain with regard to creativity or rational thinking. It's just not there. I can tell you the history of it and how we got there, but we don't have enough time for that. Please take my word for it that it's not there.
Well, could I ask one question?
Yeah.
I understand that the left brain, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are not identical.
Yes, so we'll get... No, but I'll get to the fact that, like most things, like the pineal gland as well, there's always a grain of truth. You know, in life, whenever somebody goes off on a tangent, it always starts with a grain of truth, and that grain of truth is not that. Sorry, I'm missing a picture. That picture essentially is a picture of the left brain, because as I said, they're not quite the same. So the left brain, there's an area called Broca's area, and there's an area called Wernicke's area, and they manage speech. Different aspects of speech. Broca's is expressive speech. Wernicke's area, posterior temporal lobe, is receptive speech. And almost all the time they're on the left side. Not always, but in most cases, even if you're left-handed, in most cases it's going to be on the left side, so that's where speech is going to be. Similarly, the parietal lobe is a little bit different, because in terms of visuospatial skills, a little bit more on the right, sequencing a little bit more on the left. In terms of hearing, most hearing happens in the temporal lobe on the left side, but on the right side it's a little bit more of beat and rhythm. But you use all your brain. So, for instance, just imagine yourself, you're a piano player and you're playing in a quartet. So it's a jazz quartet. I like jazz. So You're getting to sit down. You're thinking about your list and what you're going to play. This is all frontal lobe on both sides. If you read from sheet music, you have to interpret what you're seeing in sheet music. You have to sequence. You also have to remember what you were taught about how to interpret sheet music and what you're going to play. So this is a combination of sequencing and hippocampus, because you've got to dig into the memories. And then you start playing, and your cerebellum has to kick in, because you have to have posture, you have to have balance, you have to be able to coordinate your limbs. So this is cerebellum on both sides. And then you start playing a solo, and in playing a solo and you're going to improvise, you've got to remember about melody and harmony and what you were taught. You've got to remember that if you want to create a melancholy feel, a minor 30 is good. If you want to have a little bit of an edge, a dominant 7 interval will give you that. If you want to have more of an edge and an unstable size, at least an unstable feel, a flat 5 interval is going to give you that. So that's all memory, again, on hippocampus on both sides. And then you start soloing, and you're out on your right hand with your melody solo, and you've got to have your visuospatial skills to feel about where your hand is in time and space. You need your sensory cortex on both sides to be able to feel how hard you're pushing on the keys and how heavy the keys are. So you're going to feel that in your left parietal cortex on your right hand. On your left hand, you're going to feel it in your left parietal cortex. And then you need to be listening. You need to be listening to, are you in tune, especially if you're playing a wind instrument or a string instrument. You've got to be listening to what the others are playing. So this is all in your left temporal lobe, the melody and the harmony. But you've got to keep the rate and the rhythm as well. So this is in your right temporal lobe again. And then you also, you're coming up for your solo, and you feel that you're going to completely blow it, and you're fearful of it, and that's your amygdala on both sides kicking in. And then you're listening to the audience and whether they're appreciating it or not, because you really want them to appreciate. And then they suddenly start clapping, and then you get this flood of happy feelings that's driven by your hypothalamus that's controlling your hormones, and you feel good, and you're getting these reward centers, and then it goes to your frontal lobes, and you think cognitively to yourself, yes, I really am as good as I think I am. So it might be a facile example, but it's a good example of a creative activity in which you're not only using your left and your right brain equally, but you're using all aspects of your brain. And so they've done several studies looking at creativity and various ways of imaging in the brain, and there's no evidence of any different laterality between left and right brain based on actual hard science. You had a question? Sorry about that.
When they talk about left and right brain thinkers, don't we talk about more preferences and dominance rather than actually using the whole brain?
No, but again, there's no evidence of that. So they've scanned with functional MRIs, scanned people who are dominant in certain skills, creative skills, arithmetical skills, and functional MRI is a good example because it tracks blood flow to the brain. And blood flow because of something called flow metabolism coupling. So where the brain is active, the blood flows. So if you can see where the blood flows, then you know that part of the brain is active. And there's nothing to suggest that there's any difference between those who are classically dominant in creative skills and those who are classically dominant in cognitive, arithmetical, functional, rational skills. So, that's a great question. Sure. Putting me under some pressure here. So where does the brain fluid end up? It goes around the brain, it flows around the spinal cord, and then most of it, but not all of it, gets absorbed in these little things called arachnoid granulations, which poke into veins, in particular a big vein that runs down the center here. And then it flows into that vein drains via a few different sinuses into your jugular veins over here, and it goes to the heart. And the heart pumps blood, and it supplies arteries to the choroid plexus, and then the cycle begins all over again. So it's like a circle, a cycle.
What you describe has got so much to do with decision making, and obviously our brains are the thing that helps us make decisions. Stuff that I've been reading says that much of this decision making actually takes place before you're even conscious of it.
So it depends on what kind of decisions. There, like memories, there are different kinds of decision-making principles. There's a great book by Kahneman recently about the two different